Hello there and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily, your go-to podcast for everything soil-less cultivation. I'm your host, Dr. Russell Sharp, the founder of Utrema, where we make interesting fertilizers, novel biostimulants, and organic biopesticides. And today I wanted to talk about a potential hydroponic crop, and that is ferns. Should you be growing ferns hydroponically? Well, they're not a big edible crop. They're very, very niche edible crop. In fact, I think they're only eaten in Japan and some small cultures around the world. Small cultures? That's a derogatory term. Going to have another derogatory term later on. The reason why is because they tend to contain a lot of poisonous toxic chemicals, some potentially carcinogenic ones. So even in Japan where they eat ferns, they only eat the young fronds. It's not something I would recommend. So why would you grow them hydroponically? Why would you set up a business growing them? Well, they're very expensive houseplants a lot of the time. Lots of different species of ferns can be grown houseplants. The obvious example was back in the Victorian times in Britain, where people went fern crazy, fern mania, where they tried to collect as many different ferns as possible, and that was the ultimate status symbol. Forget Ferraris and Lambos, it was ferns that were the status symbol. And that led to actually reductions in the natural fern population here in the Great Britain, the British Isles, and they still haven't recovered to this day because of the fern mania in the Victorian times. So just as things like monsteras and orchids might be popular at certain times of year, at certain times, then ferns were big back then. So, like COVID lockdown, houseplant collection went mad. Back in the Victorian times, fern collection went mad. And then for outdoor cultivation, tree ferns are a really popular plant in jungle-style gardens. And in the UK here, we can really only grow one species of tree fern, and that's Dicksonia antarctica. Great species. I've got one in my conservatory. But there are lots of other different species of tree ferns that tend to grow in the southern hemisphere. I think there might be one species that grows slightly in the northern hemisphere, but that'd be like in Indonesia, barely across to the northern hemisphere. They tend to grow South America, I think, but mainly like New Zealand. New Zealand's famous for them, and take a long time to grow. And so you have to be careful to sustainably harvest them, and they should have a little tag on to say they're sustainably harvested, because the UN controls the export and trade in rare plant species and rare animals as well. And tree ferns are one of those listed, so you have to be careful. So, and also you want to reduce the carbon footprint of horticulture, then growing ferns and not exporting them around the world would be good. Because today I listened to a podcast from an Australian company that were looking to reduce the amount of ornamental plants and cut flowers that were imported into Australia. And they thought they'd have a great name for their company, and it was Grown Not Flown. And they spent quite a lot of money invested in apps and networks and databases and systems and websites for Grown Not Flown, and put a lot of effort into it, this new startup company. And then they started wearing the t-shirts advertising the company around their towns and cities in Australia, and loads of people came up to them shouting at them, talking they were scum and fascists and all this. And turns out Grown Not Flown, it has another meaning in the sort of left-wing society, should we say, where it talks about immigration and things like that. So yeah, Grown Not Flown. But yeah, if you can grow in-house plants and not fly them in, then that can potentially reduce their carbon footprint. And ferns could be one of those. A tree fern weighs a lot, and so importing that via ship or plane takes a lot of carbon. And so could you grow them hydroponically? And that's the question we're going to look at today. So let's look at tree ferns. So tree ferns, the first thing we have to realize is that they are ferns like mosses and liverworts. They reproduce by spores mainly. Some species you can do like offsets, so like pups that will form at the bottom, or from root cuttings would be a good one to try with these as well. But you're not going to produce a lot of plants from them. If you're going to have a big operation and you want to get them clean away from the soil, then you're going to look at sort of getting plants to reproduce by spores. You're going to have to collect the spores, and you're going to have to understand the life cycle. Okay, so the ability for plants to reproduce by spores evolved long before the cones and flowers and seeds and fruits found on what we call higher plants. The spore-producing plants still around on Earth have similar anatomy to those found in the fossil records, and an anatomy much less complicated than higher plants. So you can find ferns and things like lycopods or mosses in fossils, and they look pretty much identical to the ones around today. So they haven't evolved much since then. So this is why scientists often refer to spore-producing plants as primitive plants. But for some time, many of the scientists who have studied these plants consider the term primitive as derogatory for what are very complex and interesting plants. Recent studies on the genetics seem to indicate that their genes have remained largely unchanged for many millions of years. Hence, the ones in the garden today are very similar to those that existed in the fossils. So the primitive tag might be justified. So mosses, liverworts, horsetails, lycopods, which you find on nowadays, lycopods you find on small plants on bogs and moorland, but back in prehistoric times, Jurassic times, they were massive trees with massive stems that really could make use of the elevated CO2 levels that existed back then. So maybe with increased man-made CO2 levels, maybe the lycopods will have a rejuvenation, and we'll start to see them moving off the moorland and things like that. Interesting to know. So they are amongst the most unusual and obscure plants that can be cultivated in a garden or indoors, hence why they're popular for both houseplants and gardens. As I say, tree ferns give a good jungle garden feel. That's why I've got a few in my garden alongside things like Tetrapanax rex with massive leaves, or Paulonia trees, really big leaves that give you that sort of jungle feel in my back garden. Not so good in the winter, because something like a tree fern will lose its leaves if you don't wrap it up, so it can look a bit bare. But despite the wonderful form and intriguing growth strategies, there are actually very few large collections of ferns in botanical gardens. They tend to only have a few species, which is a bit of a shame, really. When they do have them, they're normally located in what's called a fernery, although there aren't many botanical gardens with ferneries. Ones that I've seen that are really good are the University of California Botanical Gardens at Berkeley has a great fernery. Kew, I think, has got a fernery as well, but the one at Berkeley is the dogs. It's really good. Berkeley Botanical Gardens is one of my favourites, if not my favourite worldwide. They'll have staff there that are experts in fern taxonomy, as well as places like the Natural History Museum in London. They've got fern experts there as well. The beauty of Berkeley is that it's got coastal fog and a warm climate, which is ideal for fern cultivation. If you're growing indoors, you need to mimic those sorts of conditions. You'll find that a lot of rare ferns grow in coastal regions with very high moisture levels. Is it the Burren in Ireland? I've never been, but that's got a number of what are termed filmy ferns, which are very rare and only grow there in the British Isles. Not many people are aware of that. So there you go. Some gardeners consider ferns and other primitive plants to be all much of a muchness, but a connoisseur of primitive plants will be able to appreciate the varied shape and features of the 20,000 different species and their hybrids. For home gardeners, fern collections in particular are actually fairly easy to incorporate into planting schemes, and they can be placed under benches as well, so you can grow them under the bench where you're growing other plants that need lots of light, so they can make up use of dead space. The problem is that difficulties with propagating primitive plants have led in the past to wild collections and this sort of fern mania in the Victorian times. The division of plants already in your collection is one possible method of propagation for many species, although it's not always possible depending on the species, and you could just kill your plant by doing it. So you need to really research it, and root cuttings, as I say, are an option as well. But if you want lots of plants, you need to understand the spore production and make sure that they can grow into new plants. When in Shakespeare's time, people thought that ferns did produce seeds, but they were invisible. So in one of his plays, I think he refers to somebody as like a fern seed, in that they were invisible. So that's an interesting, useless fact for you. Spores are not just small seeds, though. Okay, the key difference comparing spores to seeds, other than just their smaller size, they're often microscopic, is that when they germinate, they do not develop into an adult of the species they came from. Instead, when the spores germinate, they first develop into a green structure called a gametophyte. And this has one copy of the chromosomes, haploid, a bit like pollen, that they're the same chromosomes that are present in the adult, what we call the sporophyte. This is comparable to the gametophyte in seed plants, which are the pollen grains, as I say, on the anthers and the ovules in the ovary. Okay, in ferns and other primitive plants, the gametophyte still looks like a miniature plant and can, crucially, photosynthesize, but they don't grow into very big or normally look like the adult plants. But once established, the gametophyte produces eggs and motile sperm, just like the sperm in you if you're a man, or in a pig or a dog. Once they fuse, once the sperm has swum to the egg obviously that needs water, hence the humidity and the moisture required, they fuse to form a zygote. Do you remember that word from high school biology? And then once you've got a zygote, that can develop into an adult plant. And so you can see why that complicated life cycle means that ferns aren't often grown from spores commercially, and I guess it could have its advantages if you're in a very humid environment. The gametophyte can photosynthesize as well. So, but yeah, you have to understand that the spores will germinate into a small little plant called a gametophyte, and then only once they've reproduced sexually will they form into adults. And so you could get lots of fern plants from one gametophyte, so not one seed producing one plant. Unlike fungi, the spores of primitive plants are not clones, as they always go through the process of meiosis, which is the swapping of genes between the chromosomes. It mixes up the genetic material passed on to the progeny. This means that if you do want to keep the exact features of the plant, you will need to propagate it using one of the vegetative techniques like division or removing some of the pups and things like that. So imagine you had a variegated fern, you couldn't propagate them from spores. So there are an estimated 12,000 species of ferns worldwide with many different growth forms and cultivation requirements. Of all the different types of primitive plants, ferns are the most popular. The leaves of ferns are termed fronds. Why don't we just call them leaves? And that's because they produce spores on the underside of the leaves. So if you wanted to harvest the spores, you would need to leave a leaf on a surface, maybe on a piece of paper, overnight and collect the black spores that come from it. I think the spores of ferns are also used in show business as an explosive. So they blow fern spores into the air and then light them, and they give a big flash, and it's a safe way of producing an explosion, or a less dangerous way of producing an explosion. Let me just Google that and see if I'm talking absolute nonsense or if that's true. Oh, it's half right. So it's lycopod spores, which are fern-like. Instead of having fronds where the spores are produced on the back of the leaf, in lycopods, they're produced on special structures, I think are called strobili. I'm not going to Google it, but yeah, you can collect the spores a lot easier from them. So yeah, it is used, or traditionally used, for that reason. So that's interesting. So the actual little structure that the spores come from is called a sorry, the reproductive organ that contains the spores. Sometimes the leaves of palms and cycads are also called ferns and fronds, but botanists normally restrict the term frond to ferns. In mosses and liverworts, they're produced in sporangia, or they can even be in horsetails that look like a little primitive cone called a strobili. So horsetails, club mosses, you get the strobili. Can be mistaken for pests, such as scale insects as well, on the back of the ferns. You have to be careful. You don't want to be inhaling loads of spores. If you're growing these indoors or hydroponically, make sure the spores are not flying around, or if they are, that you wear a mask and protection, because obviously any spore, whether it's a fungus or a fern, if you get it in your lungs, even if they're non-toxic, they can cause farmer's lung, which is a debilitating condition, which is hard to cure if incurable. And also, as I say, some ferns contain toxic or carcinogenic compounds. You don't want to be inhaling carcinogens. So there. You can get ferns from specialist fern nurseries. They're an ideal place to source them, but you could also source a common pest and disease from them as well. So you have to be careful. There's a chili nursery near me, and you go in there and you get covered in pest and disease whenever you go in there. So I don't go in there anymore. I always buy my seeds from online for that reason. As I say, in Australia, New Zealand, tree ferns can grow to 18 meters tall. You don't get to many of them in the UK currently, that height. That is a massive height. Some people are wary of growing ferns due to the occurrence of bracken. Bracken is a dreaded weed. Even though it's a native plant, it's invasive on pastures and is toxic to livestock. And so people think that all ferns are bracken. A bit like people think all rhododendrons are bad because of Rhododendron ponticum, which is an invasive weed. People have to be educated that not all ferns are bracken, and not all rhododendrons are invasive. But some people are just absolute idiots. Another invasive fern is a zolla, but we've talked about that in the past. It can actually be a hydroponic crop because it produces massive amounts of biomass. And put it in watercourses, especially when there's too much fertilizer coming in off the fields, it can block sunlight transmitted into the water and kill off aquatic plants and animals. So there's a grass-like fern called the pillwort, and that's an aquatic fern that is increasingly popular as a margin plant in garden ponds where it thrives in wet soils, especially acidic soils, and can be used to hide the edges of plastic pond liners. Pillwort is not considered invasive and could be grown as a hydroponic crop as an alternative to a zolla. So think about that. Let's have a look at some other options for ferns. There is one massive exception to the rule that ferns love moist and wet conditions, and that's Selaginella lepidophylla, otherwise known as the resurrection fern, which I remember seeing as a kid in a garden centre and I was amazed by. And it was all dead and folded up. And my dad told me that if you take it home and you re-wet it, it will grow again. And I thought that was amazing that you could have a plant that could be just look completely dead. I might get one for my kids to have a look at. So if they still got them, still selling them. That was really interesting. It just goes into complete dormancy and only recovers when there's water, and greens up really quickly as well, I seem to remember. You'll hear a lot in horticulture about foliar uptake of nutrients and, foliar sprays. Plants can't actually absorb a lot of nutrients through their leaves because of the waxy cuticle, which I talked about on a previous episode. They just don't absorb water or nutrients very well. They might absorb a small amount, but they don't. But the difference there is in primitive plants and ferns especially, they can absorb a lot of water and nutrients through their fronds. So keeping them in a humid environment is not just essential to prevent them desiccation. It actually assists with water and nutrient uptake. This means that ferns should be irrigated from overhead sprinklers and not by drippers. So you might want to look at some sort of dripper-based system if you're doing hydroponically from above, which you would never consider. You normally think, they're all going to get mildew if I do that, and the spread damping off and things like that. So you might think of a funky way of growing the plants where you water the leaves first and then drip down. Okay. And hydration of fern through their fronds is also seen in the resurrection fern, which I talked about. So it springs back to life once misted. So they actually absorb the water through the leaves, not through their roots. Ferns have roots. Mosses and liverworts don't really have roots. They're much more primitive. I think they have something called rhizoids, which are like holdfasts, like seaweed has. So they're not really proper roots. What can we say anything else about propagation, perhaps? A lot of the ferns outdoors will produce their spores in late autumn, or certainly autumn and late summer. And so you need to be able to collect them at that time. And the spores need to be sown on the surface of the grow media, as they will be photosynthesizing as soon as they sprout. So you don't put any grow media on top of them. And the seed trays need to be kept in transparent plastic bags or a piece of glass over them to keep the humidity 100%, because they need that light and they need that 100% humidity. And you should get some young plants. You should get the gametophytes being produced and then the sperm swimming along. Be a good thing to look under the microscope for and find some fern sperm. That'd be interesting, wouldn't it? I might do that. Counter what I was saying about them liking humid environments, the spores actually open when the humidity is lower than normal. I guess that improves their ability to float through the air, and so you need some variation in humidity for the spores to actually be released. So the open dramatically fast, almost like a ballistic method, when the humidity drops, and that propels the spores away from the frond surface and into the air, so they can find soil to grow on. The easiest way to harvest the spores is to just remove the section, sacrifice a leaf, and put it on a sheet of paper, as I said. The spores will just drop straight down, and once they're released from the sorry, and it's quite a dry environment on a piece of paper. So they're normally black, brown, or yellow, the spores, and you'll get millions. You'll get a powder forming, and they can be stored in a similar manner to to seeds, low humidity and low and constant temperature. Although, like seeds, the spores of certain species cannot be stored and are termed recalcitrant. We talk about recalcitrant trees that can't be stored, like oak. Acorns can't be stored for a long time. One genus of ferns that can't be stored, the spores can't be stored, is the osmunda. Other ferns have very long-lived spores, and it's thought that this property could assist attempts to conserve ferns that have been lost from their natural habitat. And the members of the British Pterological Society, which study ferns, are dedicated to the cultivation of ferns and run a spore exchange scheme that lists several hundred species available for swapping among its members. So maybe if you're in Britain and you're interested in ferns, join the British Pterological Society with a PT at the start. Fern spores are best sown fresh in the autumn under protection and the young plants pricked out in the spring. However, if you're growing hydroponically, you could cut this down dramatically. And yeah, once they've started growing, you just got to make sure they're kept damp but not rotting. And, that's a delicate balance that you have to balance. They're normally grown in an organic compost or sphagnum peat. Finely chopped tree fern fibre, ironically, is used to grow ferns. They may want an acidic growing media, though. And so you could mess around with this and find out which is the best option. Very few species are adapted to alkaline conditions, but even the ones that are still prefer an organic medium. So peat, cocoa, things like that. But who knows whether they'll grow on other things like leca and rockwool. I don't think much research has been done. The alkaline ones want a pH above 7, which is pretty alkaline. If I was going to grow ferns and spores, then I would take my growing media and I would, if it's peat or cocoa, certainly peat or any compost from a grown garden centre, things like that. Any soil, I'd probably put them in the microwave, sterilise it with some hot water, maybe some boiling water from the kettle, because I don't want algae growing on it first. You definitely don't want to confuse algae for gametophyte and young spores, because algae will probably be your enemy when growing ferns. It can take between 6 to 12 months in the sealed bags for the gametophyte to fully develop. And then they will produce a sperm that swims to the eggs. So that is a long time. So this is not for people who are in a rush. It's definitely for the people with a passion for ferns. So if you are in a rush, then crown division is possible in most ferns, but is not produces a small number of plants and obviously damages your fern. So you have to bear that in mind. As I said, you can take rhizome root cuttings or from the runners of some species. You can't take leaf cuttings like you can on many other plants. So clones are not an option for fern propagation. On your species, you may see pegs, which are like at the leaf base. They're unusual. They're specific to ferns, and you can use them as a sort of like primitive cutting. So you remove them from the base of the plant, and despite the brutality, the peg technique can be performed with only minimal damage to the plant. So it looks worse than it is. The pegs are removed and then planted into the grow media to half their depth, in a similar manner to propagating sort of lily bulb scales. There is some reports of something called a giant cutting technique, where for propagating tree ferns, and this is stupid because it only produces one small plant from one large plant. So there's no increase in the number of plants. It's only used to get large tree ferns that are grown in wild into cultivation by shrinking the size of the plant. And so it's actually detrimental to conservation efforts because it just takes wild plants that are in their natural habitat and makes them smaller for sale in garden centres. So don't do that. A few fern species produce bulblets or plantlets on their fronds, which can be removed. Sort of vivipary that we talked about in a previous episode, where you produce like young plants without any seeds. The bulbul-forming species, such as mother spleenwort and bladder fern, are propagated easily by cutting up subsections of the frond and placing them on the top of grow medias for the bulbul to develop into a full plant. So that's a good one. I mean, you will see reports of some growers finding success with leaf cuttings as well, where the fronds can be sliced into sections and containers, but they're very, very few and far between, and not sure how scientific those studies were. Ferns that grow well in gardens but are difficult to propagate now are often propagated by micropropagation, and it's helped increase the number of plants in commercial propagation for ornamental plants, but also rare plants from the wild. So the Tunbridge filmy fern is difficult to culture by any other means and has actually been extinct in the town of Tunbridge Wells in Kent since 1875. But with micropropagation, it could be coming back. So that's good to know, isn't it? So that's been propagation of ferns for hydroponics. Where else do we think? The silver fern is it the silver fern or the white fern of New Zealand? What is the symbol of it? It is the silver fern. Maybe if you're in New Zealand or you're a New Zealand expat, then you might want to grow the silver fern, which is a beautiful species, and that's Alsophylla deobata. So maybe there's a market for that plant as well. It's a nice silvery fern. That's been Hydroponics Daily for today. Anyway, if you found it useful, then please do leave us an Apple Podcast review if you're listening on Apple Podcasts. If you're listening on any other platform, then please don't leave a review because it's useless. It doesn't help us grow the podcast in any way. What does help us is if you click follow and if you check out utrema.co.uk and see what we're up to there. If you can't spell utrema, it's Latin for wasabi. Check out the blogs, check out our interesting products and our other podcasts. Thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.